Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, a short truce between Russia and Ukraine comes to an end, with neither side showing any willingness to extend it. And the US Vice President JD Vance goes to India as the trade war between the United States and China heats up. Hello and welcome to the program. We begin in Ukraine, where air raid sirens and drone attacks pierce the night air over Ukraine and other parts of the country at the end of what was an Easter truce between Ukraine and Russia. Well, this comes as both Russia and Ukraine blame each other for breaching the truce, which was declared unilaterally by the Russian President Vladimir Putin. While Moscow claims it's been repelling Ukrainian assaults, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claims Moscow violated the truce 3,000 times since Sunday. Well, the accusations between the warring nations comes against the backdrop of the Trump administration's threat to back out of any US-led peace talks. Well, following the ceasefire announcement, however, President Trump took to Truth Social, saying that he hoped that Russia and Ukraine will make a deal this week. Well, as things stand, the truce has expired, with neither side taking the first step to come to the negotiating table. Well, let's get more on this so we can speak now to the former Secretary General of NATO, Ambassador Alessandro Minuto-Rizzo. Thank you very much indeed for being with us once again, Ambassador. President Trump saying on social media on Sunday he's hopeful that a deal can be reached this week. Is there any indication that's going to happen?
Well, this is not the first time that he says such things. If you remember, he said that the first day after inauguration, he would solve the problem. So, in fact, he keeps repeating that, an agreement is there, but it's not really taking place. It's not really happening. The impression that I have personally is that, in a way, Putin is using him because the fact that he says, the agreement is there, so the sooner the better. And on the American side, if I may make a sort of professional comment, I see some disorganization because the Secretary of State should be theoretically in charge of the negotiation. It happens everywhere like that, In this case, you have Mr. Witkoff going to Moscow very often, a personal friend of the President of the United States, fine, but he's sort of part-time diplomat because he's doing other things. And as far as we know, the person in charge of the direct contact with the Ukrainian government is another gentleman, former general. And again, this is a little bit of a bizarre way of conducting a negotiation because there is a lot of loose space between things, So now we are in a moment where it looks like the pressure is more on the Ukrainians because it looks like, because I speak in these terms because we're not sure about anything, because President Trump seems to be inclined more in favor of the Russian way of looking at things, but of course not completely. So the pressure is on Ukraine, and I don't know how they are going to do that, because the positions, from what we know, are very distant, because the Ukrainian government says that no territorial withdrawal is possible from a juridical point of view. On the other hand, we know that for Russia, Crimea is a must, and also 4 regions which have been annexed after a referendum, a sort of fake referendum. So something in the middle has to be done. What? Because the problems are, to my mind, we have 3 major problems. The first one is land. How much land, in fact, Ukraine has to give up. Let's put it that way. It's not a nice way to say things, but I think this is what's happening on the ground. The second thing is the status of Ukraine. Of course, we know that NATO is not an option, but there are many other things that can be done. And the third thing, we often forget about that, is sanctions against Russia. Because sanctions are not only given by the United States, they are also European sanctions. And so I think that for the Russians, it would be interesting to, of course, to cancel them. But, you know, if I may add one thing from a strategic point of view, if you allow me to say so, I think that the Russians should go for an agreement because from a strategic point of view, they have been recognized for the first time since 20 years or so from the Americans, from the American side, that they are a great power. There's a direct contact. The President of the United States speaks very highly about Russia, about the President of Russia. So this is an historical occasion, I think, also for Russia to get out of the limbo where it has been put in the past American administration.
Okay, and another reason why, you know, the timing it really seems... No, I'm asking you a question. I mean, another reason why the timing seems to be on Russia's side right now is that, you know, the Trump administration seems to have made quite a few concessions to the Russians, not got too many in return. One of those concessions relates to NATO. We heard the general you were talking about, General Keith Kellogg, saying that NATO membership is off the table for Ukraine. Do you think, therefore, Ukraine will never be a member of NATO?
Well, you know, this is a strange subject, if you like, if you allow me to say so, because, and I have a personal memory about that. In fact, Ukraine has never asked, from a formal point of view, to become a NATO member. So we are speaking about something that the Ukraine had never asked for. They may have this in mind, but they never asked from a formal point of view. The second thing is that it is clearly off the table, and even yourself, I mean, you are a good professional. If you think for a moment about that, in order to have a country admitted to NATO, you need a consensus. Consensus means that everybody in NATO should agree on that. It's a rule. So I don't see a consensus in NATO about the membership of Ukraine. There has never been there, by the way, because many European countries, aside the United States, would not think that having Ukraine in NATO is a good thing. Another thing is to be a good partner, to protect Ukraine, if you like, but to have a NATO membership, I think that it is off the table. It has been off the table since a long time.
Well, actually, the Russians seem to think NATO membership is a really important issue. We heard the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, saying Ukrainian NATO membership is one of the root causes of the conflict in Ukraine. I don't know what you think of that.
This is something which is, we say it all the time, you know. It is something that the Russian propaganda says. But in fact, I mean, again, if you look at hard facts, there is no reason to think that the aggression of Russia to Ukraine was because NATO was going to take over Ukraine. It is a fake news, simply. It doesn't make sense. If you want to look very carefully the history of Ukrainian relations with NATO since the independence of Ukraine, you may have one case. It is the Bucharest summit of NATO in May or June 2008, where President Bush, in fact, put on the table the question of Ukrainian and Georgian also accession to NATO. And there is a sentence in the final communique saying that one day Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO. But there was no date, no common decision on when it should happen, and it has never been repeated again. And after 2008, we had at least 10 or 12 NATO summits, and this wording were never repeated. So it's again is a fake news. If you ask me then the reasons of why President Putin aggressed Ukraine, I think that there are probably two reasons. One is a historic reason, I think, because Ukraine became independent in 1991, and from that moment on, it slowly moved towards the West, if you like, in terms of society, civil society, in terms of trade, in terms of economic, in terms of politics. Also because it is very close to Western Europe. It has a common border with Poland, with Romania, I think with Slovakia as well. So this is the movement of Ukraine toward the West. That, of course, at a moment where it goes very far away from Russia. It is true. This is true. On the other hand, I think that probably, as there was and there is a substantial Russian minority living in Ukraine, probably a certain elements of this Russian elite, or whatever you call it, oligarchs in Ukraine, went to Moscow to see President Putin, telling him that it would be an easy victory to go to Kiev because the government would collapse in a few hours and the population would greet with flowers the Russian army. And didn't go that way. You know this history. Ukraine has resisted. From a strategic point of view, I think that it is something that will go in history book, that Ukraine is still independent, even if it is losing 20% of the territory. Anyway, it is an independent country, and the government is still there. So these are the facts as far as we are today.
Okay, so we put NATO membership to one side, and you're essentially saying that's all a bit of a red herring. Then we've got a couple of other demands from Russia. One is limit the size of your army, Ukraine, and the other is hand over those 4 regions that Russia partially or significantly occupies in Ukraine. I mean, what Russia is basically asking for doesn't sound like a negotiated solution at all. It sounds like just outright capitulation. Is that how it sounds to you?
You know, it is very difficult for us, for you and for me, for anybody, to imagine, how can I say, where the final point will be. We don't know today. But you can make a few options, you know. I don't think that from a formal point of view, Ukraine is, in the mood of giving up 20% officially, formally, of its territory to the Russian Federation. But it will go, I think, I'm afraid, we will have to give some territorial concessions. So the problem is how you do that. You can have a Korean sort of ending of the conflict where you have an armistice. So it's not a legal international final decision, but de facto you have the occupying forces remaining on the Ukrainian territory, the 20%, and perhaps it will never give it back. You know, this is probably what is going to happen. On the other hand, there is the problem, as you just mentioned, of Russia having annexed, from a formal point of view, which has been ratified by Parliament, by the Duma, of 4 Ukrainian provinces, plus Crimea, that's something else. It would be a 5th province. But the issue is that Russia is not controlling at present all the territories of these 4 provinces. So again, probably if the final result, as I'm saying, is a sort of Korean armistice, so you don't fight anymore, but you remain where you are, probably the Russian interpretation of the 4 regions is that that part that was occupied by Russian forces, that is the region. You know, you can, of course, negotiate. What is important in the end, and it's very difficult to achieve, what I see, that all observers agree on that, is that the 2 positions are very distant, very distant. And this sort of shuttle diplomacy, you know, of Mr. Witkoff doesn't seem to be really going into the heart of the problem. Sure. Unless the 2 sides feel a real pressure, I don't think you are going to have an agreement.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds a lot like the United States is losing patience. President Trump said just a couple of days ago that if it looks like there isn't going to be a deal, the United States will take a pass, he said. And that would basically mean the talks are abandoned. At least that's how I interpret that comment by President Trump. What would that mean for Ukraine if the whole peace process essentially just abandoned? Would someone else? Could you see another power? Could you see Europe filling the void?
Well, frankly speaking, I don't think that the United States can be substituted by Europe. Of course, it is possible, but it's not likely. And you see that this so-called coalition of the willing organized by France is not, we don't know exactly where it's going, how, when. So I don't think that the United States can be substituted by Europe, frankly. And of course, the pressure is on Ukraine, and Ukraine maybe will have to give up because it is just inferior and cannot compete. But certainly there is some, how can I say, on the Russian side, the sense that they have lost the momentum. They can get some territory, they can win Crimea back. Okay, they are bigger, they perhaps the Ukrainians will be obliged to surrender somehow. But President Putin is losing, I think, an historical occasion for Russia, because what is really promised by the Americans now, and by the Europeans will follow, if there is a fair agreement, Russia will go back in the system of accepted countries, and sanctions will be lifted, slowly. Because I think that even in Russia, probably, there is a divided opinion, because many people in Russia think that it is better to continue the offensive because the Ukrainians are smaller, a smaller army, they are fewer people, and then sooner or later they have to give up. And this is probably the majority around the Kremlin. They are thinking that. And this is possible. But on the other hand, you have also, nobody speaks about that, but the Russian economy is not in good shape. Inflation is 20%. You have heavy sanctions hitting high technology issues. And the population, I think, is also losing support for the war, because there are a lot of people who are dying on a stupid war and a stupid battle on the borders of the country. So I think that in a strategic way, it will be very convenient for Putin to declare victory, to get Crimea and some territory, to have Ukraine not accessing to NATO, and to declare that this is a great victory, and that will stop. That's what I would do if it were him.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us once again. Ambassador Alessandro Minuto-Rizzo, thank you very much for your time today. Well, we can continue this conversation with the former chair of Foreign Affairs Committee in the Ukraine Parliament, Hanna Hopko, who joins us now from Kyiv. Hanna, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. We heard from President Trump in the last 48 hours or so saying, quote, hopefully Russia and Ukraine will make a deal this week. Are you as hopeful as President Trump?
Actually, to make a deal, and about what? Do we still believe that Putin is really interested in ending the war? No, he wants to win the war. And this is why we've seen this year they are planning to increase their spending for military, even if Russian economy is facing a lot of problems and cracks. So we in Ukraine, for 11 years of ongoing Russian aggression, we've seen a lot of examples when Russia was like lying, telling that they want ceasefire. As a former chairwoman of the Foreign Relations Committee, I remember 2014, 2019, this Minsk I, Minsk II, when everyone was praying for peaceful settlement, believing that within the political diplomatic means we could deliver ceasefire, but we've never seen a long-lasting ceasefire.
Okay, and is there anything that makes this week look more or less likely than, for example, last week in terms of actually arriving at some sort of a deal?
So look at this Easter ceasefire. Unfortunately, Russia violated its around 3,000 times, and drones were shelling and missiles attacking Ukrainian cities. So it seems like it's a kind of game when Putin wants to buy time to prepare for new invasion and new attack. And Trump, because he wants to win the Nobel Prize. Maybe Nobel Prize, not a Nobel Peace Prize, but ceasefire prize. But I've never seen a Nobel ceasefire prize. So this is why I think it's impossible to achieve any deal with Russia without justice. So justice is a key, because what's happening in Ukraine, it's Russia committing genocidal war. How should we forget about war crimes, crimes against humanity, nuclear terror, and actually Russian troops, they are present in the Ukrainian territory?
Do you think the Trump administration fully appreciates the situation on the ground? I mean, there has been talk about inviting President Trump to Ukraine for him to see for himself. Do you think that would change something?
For last 3 years of genocidal war, when Russia started the full-scale war, many Western leaders, after coming to Ukraine, especially those who visited Bucha, like President of European Commission Ursula von der Leyen, presidents of other European nations, including Meloni, all of them who visited Ukraine and seen the damages, destroyed buildings, and talking to families who lost their beloved one, talking to wounded soldiers. You could never be the same like before coming to Ukraine, seeing real consequences of Russian war in Ukraine.
It sounds like from what you've said up until this point that one of your concerns perhaps is that the United States, having set some quite arbitrary deadlines, for example, ending this call in 24 hours on the telephone and those sorts of ambitious deadlines that the Trump administration has set itself, would mean a rushed deal if a deal can be struck. I mean, a rushed deal, is that something that poses a threat, do you think? Is that a dangerous kind of a deal for Ukraine?
So it's not just dangerous for Ukraine, it's dangerous for United States and for the credibility of America. Because 11 years ago, when Russia started war from illegal annexation of Crimea, it was Russia alone. Now, Russia, North Korean troops already in the battlefield, Chinese soldiers joined Russian armed forces. So axis of tyrannies already fighting against Ukraine and fighting against also Western credibility here. So I think America is very dangerous for United States to keep losing credibility. And for Trump in person also, because this rush deal means capitulation, not just Ukraine, it means also weaknesses of America. Trump made a mistake similar to Biden mistake. Instead of demonstrating strengths as a pre-negotiation stage, demanding from Russia to deliver, like bringing back kids, release of all prisoners of war, imposing tougher sanctions, Trump started his negotiations from attacking Ukraine, criticizing our president, also cutting off intelligence data sharing with us. So Trump probably expected that we in Ukraine will be thankful for making pressure on us and ready to capitulate. No, we paid already a big price. It's not about deal. It's about justice. And actually, Putin will never accept any deal and commit like ceasefire, even ceasefire, without knowing that the West is seriously considering making tougher policy on Russian Federation. Honestly, it's about Russian imperialism. We in Ukraine facing it for centuries, but for last 3 years, when Russia, North Korea, China, Iran, de-sovereignization of Belarus already happened. So European countries should be prepared for attacks on their territories.
I mean, we've heard from the Trump administration words to the effect that if no progress is made quite soon, and we don't know when quite soon is going to be, then the United States will say, he says they'll take a pass on it, meaning they'll walk away from the whole process. Where would that leave Ukraine?
So, of course, we really thankful to American people for their support. And we understand that Trump leaving Ukraine, as Rubio said, we will move on. So it means also that Europeans should help us more. They need to confiscate Russian sovereign assets. It's about 200 billions of Russian central bank money. They need to manufacture ramp up production and provide more weapons, even if in Ukraine, within last 3 years, we increased our own weapon production up to 30%. But still, but it's not in the American interest to demonstrate weaknesses and capitulation to Russia, because everyone respects US as a strong ally. Saying I'm leaving, it means how to say, appeasing the aggressor. This is very weak position, which will not bring results, and actually Putin will keep laughing on Trump and laughing on the United States.
It's quite easy to count the concessions made by Ukraine, or concessions that have been made on Ukraine's behalf by the United States. Can you tell me one single concession that the Russians have made so far in this whole process?
So for 11 years of this war, so we've never seen any concessions. So from illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, for occupation of almost 20% of Ukrainian territories. And if you analyze the number of war crimes, crimes against humanity, so ecocide, what happened with the Kakhovka dam, occupation of the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe, Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So Russia is threatening not just Ukrainians, but also blackmailing Europeans and NATO. So tell me about concessions. No, Putin is preparing for new wars against NATO states, NATO countries, and EU, and actually together with China, North Korea, and Iran, they want to shape a new world order. Actually, Putin wants new Yalta. They want to divide the world into the spheres of influence. They don't respect international rules-based order. They don't care about human rights. They don't care about territorial integrity and sovereignty. So either Ukraine defeat Russia on our soil, or other countries, nations will need to mobilize their people to defend themselves. So, and it's cheaper for our Western partners to help us, because this war is still winnable one. Technologically, Ukraine proved that we are one of the best in producing drones, maritime drones, electronic warfare. So this is how we should become as an asset to NATO and our European allies, sharing our unique practical experience. So the world finally needs to wake up. Putin will never stop until he is punished and defeated.
But the United States says all the while, and this is the words of the US Envoy General Keith Kellogg, that President Trump has done more in 90 days to try and solve this war than anyone has done in the last 900 days. I mean, there has been a flurry of diplomatic activity. Are you saying that the United States shouldn't have tried talking to Moscow? Do you think the United States has not played its cards right?
So look, United States is positioned itself as a superpower, as the leader of free world. United States is not alone. They have their strategic partners everywhere, in Indo-Pacific region, in Europe. So the mistake was that before starting any talks with Russians, United States should have demonstrated a real strength. Strength by telling Russians, first demand, return back, bring back all kids. If you don't do this, then tougher sanctions and actually enforcement of of the package on the host fleet, on the oil and trade. So we will blockade your trade. So there are leverages that the United States has against Russian economy, Russian finance. So this should be like a pre-negotiation stage, not just talks and sending Witkov and all these guys who want to conduct another reset. Let's analyze after the Soviet Union collapse. Almost all American administration wanted to have reset with the Russian Federation. But show me the results of these resets.
I cannot answer that question off the top of my head, but let me just ask you finally, if you will. I mean, up until perhaps last week, it very much looked as though the United States was pursuing its approach to this issue. The Europeans were doing something on their own. But last week, it looked very much in Paris like both the Americans and the Europeans were back at the negotiating table talking about how to act collectively. Did that give you some reassurance?
So we need security guarantees. This is key. So when we are talking about negotiations, we have to understand what are the security guarantees. If NATO membership is off the table, then troops on the ground are what we should discuss. So this is why Putin wants to overplay Trump. He wants Trump to come to the Red Square of Moscow and to celebrate another victory. But let's be frank, even the defeat of Nazi regime in the World War II would never happen without the contribution and sacrifice of Ukrainians in last century. So now we have to defeat Russian imperialism, new fascism from Russia. So, and Putin wants to show, and blame Ukrainians, that this is a bad president of Ukraine, Zelensky, or Ukrainians, they want to fight, they don't want peace, and all this stuff. But finally, Europeans, compared to previous years, they understand what is at stake, and they try to bring Americans to the table, because what Putin wanted Europe out from the table, that to make a deal only with Russia and the US, without Ukraine and without Europe. But this war is happening in the European soil. The war against Ukraine, but this is the war in Europe. And Europeans must contribute more. They should be sitting in the table. And without security guarantees, and justice, we will never achieve any lasting, sustainable peace.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Hanna, Hopko, really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Now, Russian officials have signaled interest in a possible settlement, saying that they are working with the United States and hope that it will yield results. That's according to the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov. Well, let's find out more now about the Russian perspective on the ceasefire and the ongoing war. We can cross to Moscow and speak to former advisor to President Putin, Sergey Markov. Mr. Markov, always a pleasure speaking to you. We heard from Mr. Trump saying he's optimistic that this week could be the week that a deal is struck between the United States and Russia, and more particularly between Ukraine and Russia. Are you optimistic?
No. I even guess that Donald Trump also not optimistic. But his style of doing negotiation is to say every time that he is optimistic about the result, as that he is a winner, any other results. So it's a more personal style of Donald Trump of making political remarks. I'm not optimistic because I believe that Western side is too far from a realistic position. Russia ready for ceasefire, but Russia, already has experience of two ceasefire, Minsk I agreement and Minsk II agreement. And both of them collapsed because both of these ceasefire have been used by Ukrainian regime and by Western side just for the intensive armament of Ukrainian army and for the recovering of Ukrainian army after the defeat and then starting the war again. I should remember you that civil war in Ukraine continued from 2014 when Ukrainian army every night sharing cities of April Donbass region. So that's why Russia suggested that for ceasefire to be realistic, this ceasefire should include such conditions. First of all, stopping of the armament of the Ukrainian army from the Western countries. And as I understand, Western countries don't ready to do it. In fact, Donald Trump and the United States are ready to stop any armament of Ukrainian army. But European countries deny this peace condition of the ceasefire. That's why I don't think that it will happen now.
So what you're saying is that based on the fact that Minsk 1 and 2 didn't work, Russia doesn't trust Ukraine. Therefore, can a ceasefire ever be reached?
In fact, it's natural that both sides, which is situation of war, doesn't trust each other. And that's why Russia is talking that any realistic agreement should be based not on the words, but on the actions. And Russia agree about ceasefire, but if the ceasefire will be not used, not as preparation for the new, more bloody and more intensive war. That's why a ceasefire include embargo of the supplying of Ukrainian army by armament from abroad.
I mean, Dmitry Peskov, just for, talking about the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, who we were hearing about just before we crossed to you, he says that NATO membership for Ukraine was, quote, one of the root causes of this conflict. The United States has said once again, that's not going to happen. Ukraine isn't going to be a member of NATO. So now that that is addressed, doesn't that pave the way for peace?
Of course, it's important, not just Ukrainian not membership of NATO, but Russian guarantees that Ukraine will be not used as a place for aggression against Russia. Sorry. And this is it means that not just wars, but neutrality of Ukraine should be on the so-called Austrian model. It's exactly as happened in Austrian Republic after 2002. It means that neutrality of Ukraine should be part of the Ukrainian constitution first. Then neutrality of Ukraine should be the point for the international treaty in which United States, Great Britain, France, and Russia and European Union should take part and should sign. And also we had that if ceasefire happened, immediately European members of NATO will send their occupation troops to the Ukrainian territory, and they will claim them as peacekeepers. You know, Russians also can call their troops as peacekeepers. So these European countries will be not peacekeepers. They will be occupation troops, and Russia should have guarantees that ceasefire will be not used for implementation of the European occupation troops on the Ukrainian territory. These conditions will descend quite far to be reached.
Okay, so if that's a condition, that's something that can be negotiated and potentially overcome, this issue of peacekeepers or security guarantees for Ukraine. President Trump also saying that if progress isn't made pretty soon, the United States will just walk away from the whole process of trying to broker a deal. What would that mean for Russia?
For Russia, it's a positive result. If United States just will give up any military, financial, and another support to Ukrainian regime, it will make Ukrainian regime more weak, and it will allow Russian army to go forward. And we believe that Donald Trump's approach to the Ukrainian war is based on the narrative of the real estate from New York, real estate businessman in New York. So it's businessman constructed the hotel, but this hotel is not profitable. What should be done to sell, or if not sell, to give up? It's exactly what Donald Trump tried to do with Ukrainian war. He tried to sell Ukrainian war to Russia, to Europe, and to the Ukrainians. And if he will be successful, it's okay for him. If he will be not successful, he just will give up any participation of this conflict. It could be a positive result from a Russian point of view.
But what has Russia given up at this stage? Has Russia made one single concession that you're aware of?
The most important for Russia is not territory. You may remember from your geography lessons from the secondary school that Russia is the biggest country in terms of territories. Russia don't care about Crimea, Donbass, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and other from point of view territories. Russians care about people who live there. People who live there, they are Russians. It's for them prohibited to use Russian language. For them, it's prohibited to use Orthodox Church during we've been there more than 1,000 years. And Vladimir Zelensky aggressively attacked Orthodox Church in Ukraine. So Russia demands to Ukraine is very simple: not to make anti-Russia from Ukraine. It means that violent derussification should be stopped. All bans, all repression against Russian language should be lifted. Also, all political repression against Orthodox Church should be stopped. And also, as we remember, all political prisoners in Ukraine should be prisoned. And, you know, it's very simple indicator of the freedom of Ukraine. If former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, which had been overthrown in 2014, will be able to take part in Ukrainian elections. If no, Ukraine not democracy.
Do you think Ukraine should be part of Russia?
Most of the people believe that Ukraine should be part of Russia. But at the same time, people believe that Ukrainians have the right to decide themselves by democratic ways, either they should be independent or they should be part of the Russia. From our point of view, most realistic will be referendum in all Ukrainian regions about what they want to have, to be and still in independent Ukraine or to join Russia. And we believe that most of the eastern and southern regions of Ukraine will support the idea of rejoining Russia, which they've been part of during 1,000 years. Remember about this. And Kyiv is the Russian capital during 3 centuries.
Okay, when you say most people want to be part of Russia, are you referring to Ukraine? That's not what we've been hearing. That's not what anyone's ever told us on this channel.
As I understand, the idea of independent Ukraine is supported by 5 or 6 or 7 Ukrainian regions on the west and a little bit in the center. But something about 10 Ukrainian regions, most of all on the eastern and southern part, they prepare to join Russia again as they've been during 1,000 years.
And one other thing I wanted to ask you about is that President Trump said in the last week or 10 days that he was very angry with President Putin. I'm wondering, are you aware of him expressing that anger to President Putin in any way? Did he ever ring him up and express that he was very angry?
I think Donald Trump was not angry about Vladimir Putin, also because Donald Trump, he is very smart and he understands that it's absolutely senseless to be angry against Vladimir Putin. I think it's anti-Trump propaganda which try to create problems between Donald Trump and Putin. I strongly believe that Donald Trump respects Vladimir Putin very much.
Well, actually, President Donald Trump's words were, "I am very angry with Russia's President Putin."
Not about Putin.
He said it was about. He said it was about Putin.
Donald Trump was angry about situation which did lead to the peace deal.
He's very angry with President Putin. He said this was admittedly 3 weeks ago, so he might be less angry. We don't know.
No.
But it's with regards to negotiating a ceasefire.
No, it was not his word. It was explanation of the American media, CNBC, I think, and which is mostly anti-Trump position.
No. President Trump said in a telephone call 3 weeks ago that he is very angry. He used some vulgar language, which I can't use on this channel, to express his sentiment towards President Putin. This was 3 weeks ago in an NBC television interview.
I'm sorry, no. It's exactly what I told. It was not Donald Trump words what was cited. It was explanation of these journalists of CNBC and this TV channel, anti-Trump TV channel. So it's anti-Trump propaganda.
Okay, well, we'll try to find the clip for you. What do you think would happen if President Trump invited President Putin to the Oval Office and gave him a welcome, a bit like the welcome he gave President Zelensky? How would President Putin respond, do you think?
I think Vladimir Putin's response will be very, very polite, no. Because Vladimir Putin understands very well that his figure is demonized by his enemy. Yeah, Vladimir Putin understands that deep state, which include intelligence service of the United States, and they are not under full control of the Donald Trump, as it was during first term, and it's continue now. And Donald Trump knows that even British intelligence service also making different conspiracy against Vladimir Putin. And Vladimir Putin knows that United States intelligence service and British intelligence service fully support terroristic methods of the Ukrainian regime. That's why if Vladimir Putin will go to the United States, the possibility of terrorist attack against him will be very high.
And what about if President Trump scolded him the way he scolded President Zelensky, whether or not that was in the Oval Office or anywhere else? How would, knowing President Putin as you do, how would he respond to a public scolding like the one he gave President Zelensky?
I'm sure that Vladimir Putin, with his respect of all politicians, will not come to the dirty discussion which Vladimir Zelensky made. Vladimir Putin respects Donald Trump because he believes that Donald Trump now represents great American people.
And just lastly, I mean, is there any pressure in Russia? Obviously, President Trump wants this war to end quickly. He's said that on several occasions. Is there any pressure in Russia, for example, from the Russian public, to bring this war to an end? After all, inflation in Russia running, we're told, at about 20%. Are Russian people feeling the pain?
I would say that silent majority of the people want this war to be over. But active minority of the people making strong demands against Vladimir Putin to continue this war until positive result. And positive results meaning that ancient Russian cities like Kyiv, Kharkov, and Odessa should be rejoined Russia as millions of the Russian people who live on Ukraine.
Okay, we're going to leave it there.
They will be angry if this didn't happen.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for your time. Always a pleasure speaking to you. Sergey Markov, thank you again.
Thank you.
Now, turning our eye to tariffs, which have dominated the headlines these last few weeks. Well, they continue to make waves, rattling global markets. Well, in this context, the US Vice President JD Vance has arrived in India, where he's going to be holding talks with the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Well, this comes as the Trump administration's tariff policy heats up the trade war with China. Meanwhile, China has warned against countries making a deal with the United States that in any way impacts trade relations with Beijing. Our Commerce Ministry spokesperson in China has warned of countermeasures in the event that a conflicting trade deal with the United States is struck. Well, for more, we can speak now to Ambassador John Veroneau, former Deputy US Trade Representative under Presidents Bush and Clinton. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Just before we cross to you, we were talking about how the Vice President JD Vance has just arrived in India. What's he hoping to achieve there, do you think?
I think a number of things. One, trade will certainly be an issue since while they're suspended, tariffs, significant tariffs were imposed on India and other countries, as you know, last month. And so a major topic will be trying to find a resolution that would keep those tariffs off Indian imports to the U.S. On a more permanent basis. And no doubt they will also discuss more strategic issues such as how to collectively address problems, trade-related problems with regard to China.
I mean, India's trade surplus with the United States is $47.7 billion US dollars. I mean, obviously it's a much bigger country, and I'm just wondering whether that trade surplus is on the grand scheme of things significant, or would you say it's to be expected given the size of India?
Well, I think India does have, some market access challenges that U.S. Exporters have complained about for many years. That said, I think bilateral trade deficits or trade surpluses aren't very useful pieces of data. Countries, those deficits and surpluses change depending on what countries are making at a particular time that might be desired by one country or another. So I think overall, the bilateral trade deficits or surpluses are not meaningful pieces of information on which to base trade policy decisions.
Okay, so when Vice President Vance says to his hosts in India, we're going to raise tariffs on Indian exports from 10% to 26%, how do you think the Indian side will respond to that? Will they play ball?
Well, that remains to be seen. I do think there are some tariffs that India has on the U.S. and frankly all other countries. It's not just the U.S. are higher than the global average and very high for a developed economy such as India and a large economy like India. So I do think the concerns about market access for U.S. exporters to the Indian market are legitimate, but they are best addressed through more surgical and nuanced discussions rather than the blunt tool of across-the-board tariffs and viewing the relationship based on whether there's a trade deficit or a trade surplus.
Historically, India has gained a reputation for being quite partial to tariffs itself. And I'm just wondering whether you think perhaps India has got some trump cards that it can play during these negotiations.
Well, as you note, because they do have higher than average tariffs, and certainly much higher than U.S. tariffs or Europe's tariffs or China's tariffs for that matter, I do think they have room, India has room to lower those tariffs to address some of the concerns that the U.S. and frankly other global economies have with accessing the Indian market.
Okay, and with regards to what you were saying earlier about China, I mean, do you think there's some way that the U.S. delegation there in India can somehow play the two countries off, India and China, against each other and strike a deal to America's advantage?
Well, the U.S. and India have both, had concerns for a long time now about some of the overcapacity that China has, and China, on the one hand, produces terrific goods, well-priced goods that I think are a benefit on balance to global consumers, but they also have a practice of overproducing and flooding the global market with goods, and that poses challenges for producers and competitors in India, in China, in the U.S. alike. So I do think there would be common cause between the U.S. and India to join forces to raise these concerns or continue to raise these concerns with China. And I think China is, probably most concerned with the U.S. leading a coalition of like-minded countries who have similar concerns about Chinese overcapacity. Unfortunately, this administration's approach, the Trump administration's approach, has been more to alienate U.S. allies on this point and make it more difficult to create a coalition of like-minded countries that want to band together to collectively put pressure on China to address some of the overcapacity problems.
You say that, but the White House says that a lot of countries are coming to the United States, coming to the Oval Office, specifically on bended knee, saying, please, let's make a deal. I mean, ultimately, this might prove to have been the right strategy, mightn't it?
Well, I think there's two different issues. I think other countries are coming to the U.S. to address to lower tariffs if that's what it takes to eliminate the tariffs that are hanging over their economies now. So there could be some gains in that, and to the extent that U.S. tariff threats end up with lower tariffs globally, that's a positive thing. We'll see how it unfolds. But I think countries agreeing to reduce their own tariffs in response to tariff threats from this administration is one thing. But I think separate from that countries will be very cautious about aligning themselves with the United States against China on issues that may not serve their interests long term. Countries are going to probably play China and the U.S. off on each other, frankly, as one would expect, to assure that they're doing what is best for their stakeholders in their host country.
Yeah, indeed. And the Chinese have anticipated that, and they've said they will somehow punish or penalize countries that make deals with the United States that end up being to the detriment of China. And I'm wondering whether you think India is one such country that could end up somehow being penalized. Is there anything China can do to India?
Well, there is. Every country has some leverage, and the bigger the economy, the more leverage, frankly, they have. But also the larger the vulnerabilities. China depends on the rest of the world to sell its manufactured goods. So it has some vulnerabilities, but it also has interest in trying to allay concerns that have been building for decades now about some of the overcapacity. So I think all these negotiations and discussions will be multifaceted and complicated.
Knowing as you do firsthand how trade relations are discussed and deals are negotiated, how much of the groundwork will have been done prior to Vice President Vance's arrival in India? Do you think most of the sort of the deals will have been sort of pretty much agreed before he even landed in the country?
It's hard to say. I think historically, there would be a lot of ground having been laid prior to a visit by, a vice president. But this is an administration that the president himself is his primary trade advisor, his own primary trade advisor. So I'd be surprised if a lot of matters were settled before the arrival of the vice president. And the purpose of his visit would simply be to confirm agreed upon terms. I think it's a much more fluid situation.
Seems that Vice President Vance is getting a very warm welcome there in India. And it's said that Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Donald Trump get on quite well. The two men have some history and go back some way. I mean, does that help? What part does that play in the negotiating process?
I think it helps enormously. President Trump is very much personality-driven, so his relationships with individuals, heads of states, or CEOs seem to matter quite a bit with regard to policies he pursues. So certainly, it's a huge advantage, I think, for India that the respective heads of state seem to have a constructive relationship.
Vice President Vance has a reputation for being pretty tough. We saw that in the Oval Office with the visiting Ukrainian president. We've heard how he talks about some of the United States allies in Europe. And we also heard him referring to the Chinese as peasants in one way or another. Do you think he's likely to tread more carefully in India?
I'm sure that the vice president understands that India is a very important ally of the United States, especially in matters with regard to China. I'm sure the vice president will not be shy about expressing the concerns of the president with regard to some trade issues, but I'm sure the vice president will very skillfully discuss, what is a very multifaceted relationship that goes well beyond trade.
And just casting your mind back to when you were working for President Bush and President Clinton, I mean, just tell us how you've seen the trade relationship between the United States and India evolve during those 2 decades or so.
Well, on the one hand, the two countries have, many common interests, and I think the relationship over past, 20, 30 years has been very positive in many ways. I think India does have a complicated domestic regulatory economic environment, which is a challenge to many U.S. companies trying to do business there. India has higher tariffs than other countries, many other countries in the world. So there are trade irritants that have continued, and if the threat of very high tariffs on Indian exports to the U.S. Is successful in getting some movement on those trade irritants, then that would be a good thing.
Yeah, they've talked about 26%, currently at 10%. Obviously, 26% is a sort of a stay of execution. Could it go much higher than that? I mean, what's the upper limit?
I don't know. I think given the market's reaction to the very steep tariffs that were announced 2 weeks ago that are now paused, I think the expectation is that tariffs, at least with countries other than China, are more likely to be negotiated down rather than up at this point in time, given the uncertainty these very steep tariffs or threats of these tariffs have already imposed on the marketplace. You have a lot of companies that are just waiting to decide what to do based on what they expect the outcome of these tariff threats and tariff negotiations will be. So I think at this point in time, China aside, I would expect tariff levels to they may not go down depending on the bilateral negotiations, but I wouldn't expect them to go up.
In your experience, are Indian negotiators tough negotiators?
They're very skillful negotiators, yes.
Okay, so if there is if we can characterize the situation in the world right now as being a trade war, do things look to you as though the United States is on track to win that war?
I would agree that we are in a trade war. I was reluctant to predict that for a while, but we are clearly in a trade war now. At the levels of tariffs that are being bandied about and the retaliatory tariffs, we are in a full-blown trade war now. I don't think anyone will win from this trade war, frankly, and I just don't see how this goes well for the U.S. or our trading partners.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time to answer all those questions. Ambassador John Veroneau, thank you very much indeed.
Great, thank you.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.